The film Sound of Freedom opens with Giselle, a former beauty pageant winner, visiting Roberto Aguilar, a man of modest means, at his apartment. Roberto, a father to Rocio and Miguel Aguilar, is approached by Giselle with a modeling contract for his children. She promises a bright future for them and instructs Roberto to take them to an audition in Honduras at a provided address. Roberto leaves his children at the location, only to return and find them missing, abducted by child traffickers to be sold into slavery. The narrative then shifts to Tim Ballard, a Homeland Security Investigations special agent in California, tasked with locating abducted children and apprehending traffickers. Tim and his partner Chris are deeply affected by their work, grappling with the enormity of the issue. Despite numerous arrests, they struggle to recover the missing children. Chris considers quitting, overwhelmed by the stress. Tim, disheartened by their inability to rescue the children, many of whom are trafficked internationally, continues the pursuit. After detaining a pedophile named Oshinsky, Tim uncovers evidence of children being sold into slavery. Recognizing the vast scope of the trafficking network, Tim opts for an unconventional approach. He befriends Oshinsky, convincing him of shared interests in children, and gains valuable information through their interactions. Tim's superior grants him a week to advance the investigation. Tim's strategy pays off when he persuades Oshinsky of his sincerity, leading to Oshinsky's release in exchange for a child. This connects Tim to Earl Buchanan, who has purchased Miguel Aguilar, one of the children introduced at the film's start. Outside, Oshinsky presents Tim with a photograph of Miguel, referring to him as Teddy Bear. He informs Tim that Miguel will be handed over to him for the entire weekend, as per Tim's request, since he has arranged a meeting with Earl Buchanan. Once Tim has the necessary details from Oshinsky, he ensures Oshinsky is formally arrested by the police on charges of child trafficking. At the US-Mexico border, Tim confronts Earl Buchanan, who is with Miguel in his vehicle at the toll booth. Tim has Earl arrested by the local authorities after verifying his documents, thus rescuing Miguel. Miguel, initially frightened and traumatized, finds solace in Tim's comforting presence. Once Miguel feels at ease, Tim introduces himself properly, sharing that he has a son Miguel's age, upon learning that Miguel is 8 years old. Later in Sound of Freedom, the film depicts Miguel recounting the ordeal of how he and his sister were lured to a beach under the guise of a photo shoot, only to be smuggled out of the country aboard a transport ship by Giselle, her accomplice, and other men. Ultimately, Miguel was sold to a woman with whom he had stayed for a considerable period. He shows Tim a locket of St. Timothy and implores him to save his sister, admitting he doesn't know her location. Tim ensures Miguel's safe return to his distraught father, who has been tormented by his children's abduction. Before being sold, Rocio had fastened the locket around Miguel's neck, a token from their father, believing it would protect him. In gratitude for his rescue, Miguel entrusts the locket to Tim with an embrace. Gleaning hints from Earl, Tim begins his investigation. Meanwhile, Rocio suffers at the hands of men who exploit her. Tim appeals to his supervisor for assistance in rescuing Rocio, who hesitantly authorizes the mission and allocates a modest budget. Sound of Freedom then follows Tim to Cartagena, Colombia, where he partners with Jorge, a local officer, in the search for Rocio. They discover that Vampiro, a wealthy ex-cartel accountant, liberates children from traffickers. Vampiro, operating from a club, agrees to aid Tim after recognizing his noble cause. He warns that Rocio could be anywhere globally, given the traffickers' extensive network, and shares insights on Giselle's operations in Central America, avoiding Colombian authorities. Determined to save more children, including Rocio, Tim learns of a recently closed sex club in Thailand. He conspires with Vampiro to establish a similar club in Colombia to entice Giselle and rescue the children. Leveraging his connections, Vampiro arranges a meeting with a middleman, convincing him to support Tim's facade as a wealthy entrepreneur planning a large club. Tim's superior, frustrated by the lack of tangible results and leads, rebukes Tim for overstepping his jurisdiction and orders him to cease operations. However, Tim's wife encourages him to resign and pursue the mission. Upon learning of Tim's resolve, his boss seeks the U.S. Embassy's support in Colombia to aid Tim's efforts. In the film Sound of Freedom, Tim approaches a wealthy local, Paulo Delgado, to assist in locating Rocio. Initially hesitant, Paulo is moved by the photograph of the missing girl and commits to the cause. A meeting in Colombia is arranged with the middleman and Giselle. Following rehearsals to ensure their cover as legitimate club founders is convincing, they plan to establish a fake club on an island as a front. As the story progresses, Vampiro and Tim pose as sex traffickers, setting a snare to convince the middleman of their intent to launch the club. The middleman, linked to Giselle, informs her of the club's impending inauguration. Tim's team demands 50, 60 children for the club's opening, instructing them to bring the children to the island. Giselle and her accomplices transport the children to the island to present to Tim. However, during a police raid orchestrated by the local authorities, the children are rescued, but Rocio is not among them. The quest for freedom, as echoed in the movie's title, remains elusive for her. The captured criminals reveal that Rocio was sold to a rebel faction deep within Colombia, and the rebel leader has taken her into his jungle territory. The region is off limits to the government, and even the police and military avoid it. Jorge, the local officer, advises Tim to abandon the search for the girl, as her retrieval seems nearly impossible. The rebels heavily fortify their domain deep in the Colombian forests. Vampiro proposes they infiltrate the area by masquerading as doctors on a malaria vaccination mission. With Jorge's assistance in forging their IDs, they can pose as medical professionals. Jorge informs Tim that he can escort them only to the river's edge. Beyond that, Tim must navigate further on his own. Tim and Vampiro embark on their journey into the dense forest by boat, under the guise of carrying medical supplies. Jorge sees them off at the riverbank and arms Tim with a gun for protection. As they proceed deeper into the forest, men from another boat intercept them, demanding to see their identification. Tim and Vampiro convincingly portray themselves as doctors on a mission to halt the spread of malaria in the forest. The men permit only Tim to accompany them, insisting he use their boat. Upon arrival, Tim witnesses slaves laboring under the vigilant gaze of armed rebels. He encounters the rebel leader, El Alacrin, and explains the need to identify the ill to prevent an epidemic. In Sound of Freedom, Tim, disguised as a doctor, discovers that Rocio is also present, enslaved by El Alacrin as his personal servant and forced to process coca leaves for cocaine production. Seizing an opportune moment when El Alacrin is distracted by music, Tim locates Rocio's sleeping quarters. Gaining her trust, Tim assures Rocio of his intent to free her. However, El Alacrin interrupts, leading to a physical altercation with Tim. Amidst the commotion of the gang's music outside, Tim incapacitates El Alacrin, conceals his body, and swiftly departs with Rocio to safety. The gang members, realizing the escape, hasten to the river. Tim, with Rocio in tow, ignites the boat's engine and speeds away as the rebels give chase. He arrives at the rendezvous point where Vampiro and the police officer await in a van, guided by the signal from Tim's tracking device. They flee in the van amid a hail of gunfire from the pursuing rebels. Eventually, they elude their pursuers, reach safety, and Rocio is reunited with her father and brother. Sound of Freedom narrates this story with passion and sensitivity, culminating in a joyful resolution. Postscript: Sound of Freedom is based on a true story. In the film's conclusion, it is disclosed that Tim rescued 120 children and apprehended a dozen traffickers by the time he departed Colombia. He dedicates the success of the mission to his wife Catherine, who he says motivated him to pursue the children's rescue. Following Tim's account of the Colombian operation, the United States Congress enacted legislation to enhance international collaboration in combating child trafficking. Sound of Freedom stands out as a poignant film addressing human and child trafficking.